The morning light over the frontier is cold and unforgiving, much like the judgment of the people who inhabit the nearby settlement. For a woman long dismissed as a ghost in her own life, the suffocating silence of the plains is a familiar companion, a weight she has carried since the world decided her youth was her only currency. That silence breaks forever when a jagged trail of fresh, crimson blood cuts through the dust, leading directly to her porch. Hidden in the shadows of her weathered shed lies a dying warrior, his life slipping away in a land that demands his blood and offers no quarter. To offer him mercy is to invite a social execution, yet as she prepares to tend his wounds, she feels a spark of life she thought had vanished decades ago. The town's self-righteous elite are already sharpening their tongues, and the air grows thick with the scent of an approaching storm. In this brutal landscape, a single act of forbidden compassion is about to ignite a fire that will either burn her world to the ground or forge a future the world said she was too old to claim. The frontier doesn't just take your life, it takes your name, your purpose, and eventually, your very soul. For Abigail Sterling, a 50-year-old woman with sun-weathered skin and silver-streaked hair kept in a strict, unforgiving bun, the Wyoming Territory had already collected its debt. In the eyes of Oakhaven Ridge, she was a used-up ghost, a spinster whose only remaining value was the silence she kept on her remote ranch. They said her heart was a graveyard where tenderness went to die, a withered vessel with nothing left to offer. But the morning the silence shattered, Abigail realized the world was dead wrong. A jagged, pulsing trail of fresh crimson blood cut through the dust of her porch, leading directly to the shadows of her leaning tool shed. Inside, the air smelled of iron and sweat, and the man dying in the dark was about to turn her quiet isolation into a war zone. If you believe a woman's worth ends with her youth, hit the like button right now, because Abigail Sterling is about to prove that a fire doesn't need a young forest to burn the whole world down. Abigail gripped the handle of her heavy iron skillet, the only weapon within reach, as she stepped into the dim light of the shed. There, collapsed against a stack of cedar planks, was Coda Ironfoot. At 28 years old, he was a vision of raw, broken power, broad-shouldered with a muscular build that even a life-threatening wound couldn't hide. His long raven hair was matted with dirt, and a jagged scar across his chest pulsed with the rhythm of a failing heart. He was a tribal warrior, a man the people of Oakhaven Ridge were taught to fear and hunt. To the town, he was a predator. To Abigail, he was a human being leaking his life onto her floor. His piercing gaze caught hers, and for a second, the stoic, fiercely independent woman felt a jolt of electricity she hadn't known in 20 years. She knew the rules of 1878. Harboring a man like Coda wasn't just a scandal, it was a social execution. It was an invitation for the town's self-righteous elite to descend upon her homestead with ropes and torches. She didn't hesitate. Abigail dropped the skillet and reached for her tin basin and linen strips, her movements steady and resilient. As she knelt beside him, the weight of her decision settled into her bones. Outside, the vast plains of the Sterling homestead stretched toward jagged rock formations, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the shadows. Abigail looked at the silver locket hanging near her washbasin, a discarded heirloom representing her suppressed past and the youth she had been told was gone. She realized then that being invisible had been her armor, but today she was choosing to be seen. She began to cut away Coda's tunic, her steady grey eyes meeting his intense, grateful stare. He didn't look at her with the pity the townspeople did. He didn't see a withered woman. He saw a survivor of 50 seasons whose strength was a badge of honor. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Abigail knew that every second Coda stayed on her ranch, the clock was ticking. In Oakhaven Ridge, Beatrice Whitmore was likely already pouring tea and sharpening her tongue. Beatrice, 52, and always dressed in stiff black lace, was the self-appointed moral compass of the town. With her sharp features and narrow eyes, she lived to find the rot in other people's lives, to distract from the hollow coldness of her own. If Beatrice even suspected that Abigail was tending to a wounded warrior, the consequences would be lethal. Abigail worked quickly, the linen strips turning red as she pressed them against the jagged hole in Kodas' side. He groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the small shed, and Abigail placed a firm, calloused hand over his mouth. The silence of the frontier was a lie. Someone was always listening. What would you risk to save someone the world wants you to hate? Is mercy worth the price of your own safety? Let us know in the comments below right now. As the sun climbed higher, the heat began to bake the Sterling homestead. Abigail managed to move Koda into the main house, hidden beneath the floorboards of the guest room she never used. Every floorboard creak sounded like a gunshot. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that made her feel more alive than she had in decades. She was no longer a ghost. She was a conspirator. However, the danger wasn't just coming from the town's judgment, it was coming from the dust. Caleb Whitmore, Beatrice's 24-year-old son, was already on the move. Caleb was lean and aggressive, possessed by a restless energy and a desperate need to prove his worth to his manipulative mother. He had been tracking the same trail of blood that led to Abigail's porch, his cruel smile widening with every crimson drop he found in the dirt. Back at the ranch, Koda's fever began to burn. He gripped Abigail's wrist as she tried to cool his forehead with a damp cloth. In his delirium, he spoke in a low, melodic tongue, his voice a mixture of pain and reverence. When his eyes finally cleared for a moment, he looked at Abigail with an intensity that terrified her. He saw the silver in her hair, not as a sign of decay, but as a mark of wisdom and endurance. To him, she wasn't used up. She was a mountain that had weathered 1,000 storms. This connection, growing in the quiet spaces between his labored breaths, transcended the cruel mathematics of age. It was a bond forged in the shadows, far away from the narrow-minded whispers of Oakhaven Ridge. But the peace was short-lived. Abigail heard the distant thud of galloping hooves. She stood by the window, her hand instinctively reaching for her Winchester rifle. The weapon felt heavy and cold, a familiar weight that reminded her of the father who had taught her to defend what was hers. Through the glass, she saw a cloud of dust rising from the trail. It was Caleb Whitmore, and he wasn't alone. He had the restless energy of a predator who had finally caught a scent. Abigail looked back at the closed door of the guest room. She had two choices. She could hand Koda over and reclaim her status as a harmless, invisible spinster, or she could stand her ground and face the wrath of a town that hated anything it couldn't control. The hounds of propriety were circling the ranch, and the tension was reaching a breaking point. Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment the frontier explodes and Abigail Sterling shows the world what a used-up woman is truly capable of. Caleb pulled his horse to a sharp halt just yards from Abigail's front door. He sat there for a moment, his sun-reddened skin glistening with sweat, his eyes scanning the porch with a predatory focus. Abigail stepped out, the Winchester held casually but firmly across her lap as she sat in her rocking chair. She forced her face into a mask of stoic indifference, the same mask she had worn for 20 years. "You're a long way from town, Caleb," she called out, her voice steady despite the roar of blood in her ears. Caleb smirked, leaning forward over his saddle. He pointed a gloved finger at a dark spot on the porch steps, a spot Abigail hadn't managed to scrub away. "That's a lot of blood for a woman who lives alone, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice dripping with a false politeness that made her skin crawl. "My mother says you've always been a bit too fond of your privacy. I'm starting to wonder what you're hiding in that big, empty house." Inside, Koda Ironfoot lay beneath the floorboards, his breath shallow. his hand resting on the hilt of a knife he had kept hidden in his boot. He could hear the confrontation outside, the sharp edges of Caleb's voice cutting through the dry air. He knew that if he were found, Abigail would hang alongside him. The injustice of it burned hotter than his fever. He watched the dust filter through the cracks in the wood above him, waiting for the moment he would have to rise and die to protect the woman who had risked everything for a stranger. Abigail didn't flinch. She adjusted the rifle, the barrel pointing just inches away from Caleb's direction. "The only thing I'm hiding, Caleb, is my patience. Now get off my land before I decide you're trespassing." The standoff was a silent explosion waiting to happen, a collision between the old world's judgment and a new, forbidden spark of life. If you enjoyed this journey of courage and late-blooming passion, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more legendary tales of the Old West. Caleb's horse kicked up a final cloud of suffocating dust as he yanked the animal's head around, his eyes lingering on the porch with a promise of violence that didn't need to be spoken. He rode away, but the silence he left behind was heavier than the sound of the hooves. Abigail didn't move until the rider was a mere speck against the jagged horizon. Her fingers were white-knuckled around the cold steel of the Winchester, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew this wasn't an end. It was a stay of execution. The town of Oakhaven Ridge was a place that fed on the perceived failures of women, and she had just handed them a feast. She retreated into the house, the floorboards groaning under her boots. The air inside was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the bitter scent of the herbs she had used to mask the smell of infection. She moved the heavy oak table, her muscles screaming with a strength she had forgotten she possessed, and pried up the loose boards. Below, in the darkness of the crawlspace, Coda lay as still as a fallen monument. His skin was the color of weathered clay, slick with a cold grey sweat that told her the fever was winning. Abigail reached down, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. She helped him rise, his massive frame leaning heavily against her smaller, wiry frame. She guided him to the small bed in the corner of the room, every step a calculated risk. As she laid him down, the light from the window hit his face, revealing the deep lines of pain etched around his mouth. He looked at her then, his eyes fluttering open, dark and piercing even through the haze of agony. There was no judgment in his gaze, no expectation of the used-up woman the town saw. He saw a protector. He saw a warrior who had fought battles he couldn't begin to name. She reached for the tin basin, the water inside already pink from previous washings. As she dipped the linen strips into the cool liquid, she felt the weight of the silver locket hidden beneath her collar. It was a relic of a girl who had once believed in fairy tales, a girl who had been told that her only value was in her youth and her ability to serve a husband. Now, at 50, she was touching the skin of a man who looked at her as if she were the most powerful force in the frontier. The cleaning of the wound was a slow, agonizing process. Coda didn't scream, but the way his muscles bunched and his jaw locked told her everything. Abigail worked with a grim focus, her silver-streaked hair falling loose from her strict bun. She didn't care about the propriety of a woman tending to a man in such a state. The rules of Oakhaven Ridge felt like a distant, flickering dream compared to the raw reality of the life beneath her hands. Every time her fingers brushed his skin, a jolt of something long dormant flickered in her chest, a spark of life that the town's self-righteous elite had tried to extinguish decades ago. Outside, the wind began to howl, rattling the window panes of the homestead. It felt as if the world itself was trying to break in. Abigail knew that Beatrice would already be whispering in the shadows of the general store, her narrow eyes gleaming with the chance to finally destroy the woman who refused to bow. Beatrice saw Abigail's independence as a personal insult, a crack in the rigid social order she worked so hard to maintain. To Beatrice, a woman without a man was a tragedy, but a woman who didn't need the town's approval was a threat that had to be neutralized. As the afternoon bled into a bruised purple evening, Koda's fever spiked. He began to mutter in a language Abigail didn't understand, his hands grasping at the air as if searching for a lost weapon. She sat by his side, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, her voice a low, steady hum as she recited old poems her mother had taught her. She wasn't just fighting for his life, she was fighting for the version of herself that had finally dared to step out of the shadows. In a moment of lucidity, Koda reached out and caught her wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were clear. He spoke in broken English, his voice a gravelly whisper that vibrated in the small room. He told her she had the spirit of the mountain, a strength that only came from surviving 50 winters. He didn't see the wrinkles or the sun-weathered skin as defects. He saw them as a map of her resilience. Abigail felt a tear track through the dust on her cheek. For the first time in 20 years, she felt seen. Not as a daughter, not as a spinster, but as a human being with a soul that still had fire left in it. But the peace was a fragile thing. A sudden sharp knock at the door shattered the intimacy of the moment. Abigail was on her feet in an instant, the Winchester back in her hands, before the sound had even died away. She didn't ask who it was. She knew. She opened the door, just a crack, the barrel of the rifle leading the way. Beatrice stood there, draped in stiff black lace, her face a mask of feigned concern that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. Behind her, the silhouettes of several men from the town loomed in the darkness, their faces obscured by the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats. Beatrice didn't wait for an invitation. She spoke with a voice like shattering glass, accusing Abigail of harboring a criminal, a savage who had supposedly shed blood in the hills. She spoke of the safety of the town, of the moral duty of a Christian woman, and of the consequences for those who turned their backs on their own kind. Abigail listened, her face a mask of stoic indifference, but inside she was calculating the distance to the barn, the amount of ammunition she had left, and the strength Koda had regained. The confrontation in the doorway was a battle of wills. Beatrice tried to push her way in, her narrow eyes searching the shadows for any sign of the intruder. Abigail stood like a stone wall, her grey eyes fixed on Beatrice with a level of defiance that made the older woman recoil. Abigail told her that her house was her own, and that the only savages she saw were the ones standing on her porch, ready to condemn a man they didn't know, based on the whispers of a bored, vindictive woman. Beatrice's face contorted with rage, the mask of propriety slipping to reveal the venom beneath. She promised Abigail that by sunrise the whole town would know of her shame. She promised that the sterling name would be dragged through the dirt until there was nothing left but ash. As the group retreated into the night, Abigail knew the clock was ticking. The hounds were no longer just circling, they were closing in for the kill. She turned back to the room, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Koda was sitting up, his back against the headboard, the silver locket clutched in his hand. He had found it on the bedside table. He looked from the locket to Abigail, a raw confession of shared loneliness passing between them without a single word. He offered to leave, to lead the posse away and die in the hills so she could keep her home. Abigail walked over to him, her movements fluid and determined. She took the locket from his hand and threw it into the cold fireplace. She didn't need the past anymore. She looked at Koda, her gaze fierce and unwavering. She told him that she had spent 50 years being invisible, 50 years waiting for her life to begin. She wasn't going to let a pack of cowards take away the first thing that had made her feel alive in decades. They spent the remaining hours of the night preparing. Abigail cleaned the Winchester, her movements rhythmic and practiced. Koda sharpened his knife on a whetstone, the rasping sound a grim melody in the quiet house. They spoke of their lives, of the families they had lost, the dreams that had withered in the harsh sun of the West, and the strange, forbidden desire that was blooming in the wreckage of their circumstances. As the first hint of grey light began to touch the horizon, Abigail stood by the window. She could see the torches flickering in the distance, a line of fire snaking its way toward the homestead. Caleb was leading them, his need for approval finally manifesting as a bloodlust he couldn't control. The town of Oakhaven Ridge was coming to reclaim its used-up woman, but they were about to find out that Abigail was anything but finished. The frontier was about to explode, and the woman they had dismissed for so long was ready to hold the match. The orange glow of the torches danced like malevolent spirits against the weathered wood of the porch, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched toward the horizon. Abigail stood behind the heavy oak door, her fingers tracing the cold, familiar steel of the Winchester. She could hear the rhythmic thud of hooves, the jingle of spurs, and the low, guttural murmurs of men who had traded their humanity for a sense of righteous vengeance. Caleb was at the front, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and unearned authority as he called out her name. He demanded she surrender the outsider, his words laced with the poison his mother had spent years brewing in the tea sets of Oakhaven Ridge. Abigail felt a strange, chilling calm settle over her. The woman who had spent decades shrinking into the corners of her own life was gone, replaced by someone forged in the fire of the last few days. She looked back at Coda, who stood in the dim light of the kitchen. He was pale, his breathing still shallow, but his eyes were clear and fixed on her with a depth of respect that no man in Oakhaven had ever dared to offer. He reached for his knife, but Abigail shook her head. This was her house, her life, and her stand to make. The mob gathered in a semicircle, their faces illuminated by the flickering fire. They were men she had known her entire life, men who had bought eggs from her, men who had tipped their hats in the street while whispering about her loneliness behind her back. Beatrice stood just behind Caleb, her face a mask of cold triumph, her eyes scanning the windows for a glimpse of the scandal she had manufactured. Abigail pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the torches and the restless shifting of horses. She didn't look like a victim. She stood tall, the rifle held across her chest, with a casual competence that made the men in the front row recoil. Caleb stepped forward, his chest puffed out, trying to reclaim the narrative. He shouted that she was harboring a murderer, a savage who had spilled blood on their sacred soil. Abigail let him finish, her gaze never wavering. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and carried a weight that cut through the night air like a blade. She told them that the only blood on her porch was the blood of a man who had been hunted like an animal, and the only savages she saw were the ones hiding behind torches in the middle of the night. Beatrice pushed her way to the front, her voice a shrill weapon. She accused Abigail of losing her mind, of being seduced by a monster, and of betraying every value the town stood for. Abigail looked at Beatrice, really looked at her, and saw the hollow shell of a woman who had spent her life policing the joy of others because she had none of her own. Abigail told her that the values of Oakhaven were nothing but a shroud for the dead, and she was tired of living in a graveyard. The tension snapped when Caleb, desperate to prove his manhood, leveled his own pistol at Abigail. He screamed for her to move aside. In that heartbeat, Coda appeared at her side. He didn't move with the frantic energy of the mob. He moved with the grace of the mountains. He didn't speak their language, but the way he placed a hand on Abigail's shoulder told them everything they needed to know. He wasn't a captive, and she wasn't a victim. They were a unified front against a sea of mediocrity and hate. The mob wavered. They had come for an easy execution, a way to purge their own insecurities by destroying a woman who had finally found her voice. They hadn't expected to face two people who were willing to die for the dignity of being seen. Abigail raised the Winchester, the barrel glinting in the torchlight. She told Caleb that if he took one more step, he would find out exactly how much a used-up woman had left to give. The young man froze, the bravado draining from his face as he realized that Abigail wasn't bluffing. He looked back at his mother, seeking guidance, but Beatrice was silent, her eyes wide with the realization that she had lost her grip on the one person she thought she could always control. The men behind them began to mutter, the collective heat of the mob cooling under the icy resolve of the woman on the porch. One by one, the torches began to dip. The blacksmith was the first to turn his horse away, followed by the baker. They were cowards at heart, driven by the wind of Beatrice's malice, and that wind had finally run out of breath. As the mob retreated into the darkness, the silence that returned to the homestead was different than before. It wasn't the suffocating silence of isolation, it was the quiet of a battlefield after the smoke has cleared. Abigail lowered the rifle, her muscles aching from the tension. She turned to Coda, and for the first time in 50 years, she felt the full weight of her own existence. He took the rifle from her hands and set it against the wall, his touch lingering on her skin. There were no words needed. The town would never forgive her, and the life she had known was effectively over. But as she looked out over the vast moonlit plains, she realized she had never been more free. The Sterling name might be dragged through the dirt as Beatrice had promised, but Abigail was no longer a name on a deed or a ghost in a parlor. She was a woman who had chosen her own destiny. By the time the sun began to peek over the jagged rock formations, Abigail had packed a small satchel. She left the silver locket in the ashes of the fireplace, a relic of a woman who no longer existed. She led 2 horses out of the barn, her own sturdy mare and a chestnut stallion for Coda. They didn't look back at the house as they rode away. The homestead, with all its memories of duty and quiet desperation, was just a silhouette against the rising sun. They rode toward the horizon, toward the high country where the air was thin and the rules of Oakhaven Ridge couldn't reach. Abigail felt the wind on her face, the sun warming her weathered skin, and she smiled. She was 50 years old and her life was just beginning. Coda rode beside her, his presence a constant grounding force. They were 2 survivors of different worlds, brought together by a trail of blood and a shared refusal to be invisible. As Oakhaven Ridge faded into a speck of dust behind them, the frontier opened up, wide and unforgiving and beautiful. Abigail Sterling wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a legend in the making, a woman who had looked into the heart of the graveyard and found the strength to walk out of it, leaving the dead to bury their own. The West was a place of brutal endings, but for Abigail and Coda, it was the site of the most unexpected and defiant beginning. They disappeared into the golden light of the new day, leaving nothing behind but the echoes of a courage that the town would whisper about for generations. A story of a woman who found her heart not in the safety of the crowd, but in the shadow of a stranger. Now that the Warrior's Truth has finally come to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic revelations.